Today, we're talking about a poet whose name you probably know, John Keats. We think of beauty, romance, but his actual story? It was anything but. It's a story of incredible tragedy, of brutal classism, and a creative genius that just burned unbelievably bright and way, way too fast.
So imagine you've poured your entire soul into your work, and then you open up a major publication and read this. This wasn't just a bad review. This was a critic telling you, in public, to quit, to go back to your day job. This was the world John Keats was up against.
So that's the big question, right? How does the guy who got this takedown, who died at just 25, totally dismissed by the literary elite, end up being talked about in the same breath as Shakespeare? Well, that is one incredible story, and we're going to unpack it.
Here's how we'll do it. First, we'll look at why they attacked him as a so-called Cockney poet. Then we'll dive into his tragic backstory and a choice that changed everything. After that, we'll get to his miraculous burst of creativity, figure out his revolutionary ideas about poetry, and finally trace how he achieved his immortal legacy.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, the mocked Cockney. You see, to really get why the critics were so vicious to Keats, you have to understand the rigid, snobby class system of 19th century England.
The thing is, the critics didn't just dislike his poetry. They disliked him. They threw him into this group they called the Cockney School. And let's be clear, this wasn't a real school. It was a slur. It was just a nasty label to brush off any writer who wasn't born rich and didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge.
And what's so telling is what they attacked. It was his background, the fact he didn't have a fancy degree. They even nitpicked his rhymes, saying pairs like thorns and fawns were improper. Basically, they were the gatekeepers of literature, and in their eyes, Keats, this kid from a humble background, didn't belong.
So who was this outsider they were so afraid of? Well, let's get into our next section and see how a life just filled with tragedy ended up forging one of the world's greatest poets.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It is absolutely brutal. His dad dies when he's only 8. Then his mom dies of tuberculosis, the same disease that would get him when he's just 14. A year later, he's training to be an apothecary, basically a pharmacist and surgeon. And by 20, he's fully qualified. He's got a safe, respectable career right in front of him.
And this is the moment. This is the crossroads. He makes a choice. He literally walks away from a stable, secure life in medicine to chase the uncertain, probably poverty-stricken life of a poet. The very life that critic was making fun of. It was just an unbelievable leap of faith in himself.
And what came after that decision is maybe one of the most incredible, concentrated bursts of creative genius literature has ever seen, which brings us to 6 years, 6 odes.
Now let that sink in for a second. 6. That's the total number of years in his entire writing career. For most artists, that's just the warm-up. For Keats, that was everything he had.
And then there's this number, 25. That's how old he was when he died. An age when most of us are just starting to figure things out. His voice was about to be cut short forever.
But right in the middle of that impossibly short time, he had 1 year, 1819, that was just pure magic. In only 7 months, he wrote the 6 great odes. We're talking Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, the poems that made him immortal. The sheer creative firepower in that short span it's just mind-boggling.
So what was it about his poetry that was so different, so revolutionary? This is where we get to the core of his genius, and why people started calling him the Shakespeare of poetry. He came up with this idea he called negative capability. Now, it sounds complicated, but the concept is really profound. It's about a writer being comfortable with mystery, with not knowing all the answers. It means getting your own ego out of the way, so the thing you're writing about, whether it's a nightingale or an ancient piece of pottery, can just be itself.
And this comparison here just nails the difference. On one hand, you have the Milton-style poet, always present, always imposing their powerful voice on the poem. But on the other hand, you have the Keats and Shakespeare style, the poet as a chameleon who disappears into the subject and just lets it exist, mysteries and all. This was a totally new way of thinking about what a poet should do.
So this brings us to the last and maybe the most incredible part of his story, his legacy. Because despite all this genius, Keats did not die famous. Far from it.
He died in 1821, basically unknown, convinced his name was, in his own words, writ in water. But then a funny thing happened. Other poets started reading him, championing his work,
And slowly, over decades, his reputation started to build, until the mocked outsider became a giant of English literature.
And his reputation has only gotten stronger. Just listen to this quote from one of today's top critics, Helen Vendler. She says his odes are the most achieved and convincing poems in the whole language. What a turnaround from the guy who told him to go back to selling pills, right?
So here we are, more than 200 years later, and the work of this young man, who was dealt such a tough hand, still shapes how we think about beauty, truth, and art itself. Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. How is it possible that the poems of a young apothecary, written in this feverish rush over 2 centuries ago, can still feel so alive and still say something so powerful about what it means to be human? Well, that, right there, might be the true measure of his genius.